Wow. Some expensive t-shirts.
And they, my girls, do you think they could give some of that to the girls?
Right, that's a lot of money. That's awesome. It is cute.
But I taught them.
Oh, okay, well, thanks.
And what do you teach?
So I taught social studies.
Right,
Okay.
right, well, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you also.
Yeah.
Is that what you're doing now, or are you doing something different?
Not anymore. Just work with teachers.
Good morning.
How are you?
Wanted to respect your time.
Is it your own?
Laura.
What's your business you're doing?
Yeah, so.
Alan Huntington.
Okay.
Yeah.
Danish from Pennsylvania. I'm from Colorado.
Okay. We're just implementing, we have been a part of other districts that are a little more ahead of the game right now. I'm curriculum director and I'm just now still making gains, but so we have not
Making
really.
gains on.
Well, we just implemented Project Innovate because literally
Okay.
I'm one of the only people, so I don't have any self-starters in the engineering areas, but just now refining how to do projects.
And how old are your kids?
Yeah. We'll make gains, but yeah.
Yeah, so making gains on that one. Okay.
How do we
Project design.
how do we grade projects? Like,
Oh, okay.
yeah, there's yeah.
It's kind of a hobby horse of mine.
And that's where we're at. So the whole district as a whole, the assessment person identifies need, but in those areas, that's what
Okay.
the biggest thing.
It starts at 2.
I feel like they don't get enough attention. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
I
that's
know. Because I was like, you are gonna be on time.
because it just ends up all being process. And everyone gets to some
Busy.
or in the product. because
Yeah.
it needs to happen in the right way. A lot of teachers are very
Hello there.
So we got into that deeply here.
Okay.
But we have a lot of resources on our website.
Okay.
Great.
And I assume that you travel and work with districts.
I have for the last 8 years. I've taught at a lot of different levels. I mean, over the last year was sort of traveling clients.
Okay.
And but this year, for 8 years, I was sort of like a product and working. I had no Colorado, so I was and now suddenly this year, I got lots of work locally, so I'm traveling. Actually, very nice. My son is a graduate.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Totally.
Like that. Right there. Did you speak with the folks from British Columbia?
I did talk to
Did
one.
you? Okay.
Yeah, and I actually grew up in California.
Okay.
In the 70s.
They have some really interesting.
Right.
It is. It is. I'll be watching.
Well,
Nice to meet
meet
you. Nice to
All
meet
right.
you.
Yeah. And Sean
Yes, sir.
from Indiana, not from
Indiana, yeah.
So I didn't know if you were.
It's nice to
Yeah,
see
yeah.
each other,
I
but
see-
never.
yeah,
I like
yeah.
when you jump down next to people they don't necessarily know. It's a good sign. Right?
Yeah.
Everybody does not need their
Well,
own.
you know,
church.
these two seats were crazy about, that was my choice. Okay.
And also conveniently out of camera.
Oh.
Everyone here's going to avoid being
Yeah.
in camera. So, is that your choice, Adina, to try to stay out of camera?
I'm strategic where I can see people.
Okay, that's cool. Well, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Right. So my parents live in upstate New York, and I go through Harrisburg actually. Keep going. Right. So are you? You're not from? No. Well, I'm originally from. Oh. Yeah. Right. have you guys some stories? There are no Steelers fans. I'm from Ohio, so not like the Steelers these days too much. Oh yeah.
Morning.
Yeah. Well, I know from outside perspective, probably not so much fun, but that sounds like a great time to me.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in Ohio the last couple of years. Wonderful schools.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah. I'm from Sycamore, which I don't know. Yeah.
Actually, I've worked with them.
Yeah. My brother's a basketball coach there.
I just put a, I just had a female who's one of the principals there. Was a student issue.
So are you finding that there's more interest in, I think, facilitating workshop or learning with how to do it? I think it's more in the urban or have you noticed there's a pattern of that?
You know, we've worked in schools that are literally low in America.
And do you call it, is it client or someone who had this conversation or
So there are all kind of.
We are, yes.
right.
I honestly.
Presenting? Yeah, no worries. And welcome.
Hi, how are you? Kevin.
Kevin, Tim Cooper.
Nice to meet you.
Where are you coming from?
Malvern.
Just outside the city somewhere. Okay. You know the color of it,
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I saw Isty's out in Denver,
Yeah.
and said I would love to see if I can make it out there.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, it's gonna be nice to have it in the backyard.
Yeah. Well, and it was here last year, so it's nice.
Yeah.
I completely understand how it's nice to have it back.
Yeah. Weather. Nervous when I'm gonna get home.
Expecting.
Supposed to go with big blizzard. Definitely won't be school. At least I can sleep in.
Yeah.
So you would probably try to encourage you to sort of gather closer to the city. Have a small, just a little more conversation. It's nice of her to have their own table.
So
Well,
I won't get comfortable.
We'll get started here in a moment. You're probably fine here.
Okay.
We'll be around for two.
Sounds good.
Right, because you just got them away at the end, and that's what we're trying to figure out how to do. Right. The science teacher, with RD, probably we could see that idea that there's, you still come back to it and with project basis, that there's a final end in mind. We have this nice little conversation.
So given that we're a relatively small room, I'd like to encourage people to sort of come more to these center four tables as possible so that it can feel more conversational. I don't think there's a need to necessarily push the tables together. We can have some space, but if you wouldn't mind coming up to one of these four. Several
several different people have come in and stood there and then disappeared. So you.
Yeah, I'm.
Okay, cool.
Maybe it's myself, so.
Is it Casey?
Yeah. Oh, no, yeah.
Cool. All right. We'll get started here in just a moment.
Yeah, sounds good.
Let us know if there's something that's not coming through clearly. It's hard to hear.
Sure. That's the design. Thank you. Yeah.
Wendy, you can hop over and join one of the other tables here so we have a little more conversational space. Okay, so we are being live streamed. I want to just, if you have a colleague or a friend who couldn't make it to EduCon today, if you want to share the information about that. First off, the Wi-Fi is up there. You probably know it by now, EduCon, the password is 2.8, I think still. And the live stream hashtags, if you want somebody to find this live stream and hear what you heard, especially if you're trying to take some of these ideas back to your schools, then obviously EduCon, but also session 4 and hashtag room 304 are ways that people can find the live stream. That'll be up on YouTube later today. So if there is something that you take away from here and you'd like to share, you have that as a resource to take back. So welcome. We are going to try to keep this largely conversational with a couple of different moments, really focusing around the center of the room. So I appreciate those of you who abandoned your entire table to yourself and came back over. My name is Tim Kubik. Dana, you have the clicker, right? And this is Dana Lauer. I'm coming to you from Northern Colorado.
Just down the road, depending on traffic, about an hour and a half over to Harrisburg, which we're hoping there's not traffic on the way home because my daughter has a 2 o'clock basketball game.
Cool. You want to click to the next slide, Dana? So I know most of us are aware that time is a really scarce resource. There's a video that we are really fond of by a guy named Elvis DeLeon, who's a designer in New York. It focuses on the fact that there are 86,400 seconds in a day, and you never get those back. We're not going to show the video because we want to remain conversational. But we've got 5,400 seconds together today, and that's not actually a ton of time when you think about it. One of the things that we think is tremendously important if you're going to be engaging students in authentic and relevant learning is finding out where they are. So we'd like to spend some of those seconds just having a chance for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your name, where you're from, perhaps what you teach. We'll get to a chance to talk about some of these ideas of authentic and relevant learning as we do the work. So right now, if you just take a moment to introduce yourselves, and then Dana and I will say a couple things more about ourselves other than where we're from. But we'd like to start us off and then just sort of whip around the circles. Okay, thank you.
My name is Adina Sullivan, and I'm an EdTech coordinator for a K-12 district in close to San Diego. And I support teachers in EdTech professional development, including our inquiry-based one-to-one program.
My name is Sean Connor. I'm principal of Zionsville Middle School in Zionsville, Indiana, which is a suburb of Indianapolis.
I'm Laura Whitman. I am supervisor of secondary C&I. Support about 350 teachers in a school district near Allentown, Pennsylvania.
I'm Marianne Malicious, and I teach right outside of Philadelphia in Bucks County in the Council Rock School District. I teach 5th grade, and I also coordinate a summer STEM academy in our district for grades 3 to 8.
I'm Kevin Moore. I teach 11th and 12th grade AP Calc at Malvern Prep, and as well as part of a team of teachers to redefine and remake learning for the 9th and 10th grade experience. That'll be completely inquiry-based and project-based.
I'm John Downs. I work at the Tarrant Institute at the University of Vermont. We work with middle schools around the state to help them transition to tech-rich, student-centered learning.
I'm Wendy Moss. I teach 8th grade English in Richmond, Virginia, the collegiate school.
Please.
I'm Ashley Smith. I'm a science student teacher here at SLA. I teach 10th grade computer science.
Okay. I'm Paula Donner, Director of Educational Technology here in the school district.
I am Tiffany Graff. I'm a technology program specialist. And also an academic.
Okay.
Darrell Ensminger. I work in education at the state level in New Jersey. I deal with most issues, mostly at PBL Tech. And I'm also an adjunct with Delaware.
At where?
Delaware Valley University.
Okay. Cool. And We've got a group joining us here. We'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves as well, and then we'll get started. So, I know Letitia. All right.
Yes, Letitia Whittington, special education teacher at Southwest Philadelphia. My son, Noah.
We like to get started really.
Our partner Jill Akers, who is not here with us, has Spanish dual immersion project-based learning preschool and kindergarten in Dallas that does wonderful stuff with children not much older than that. So excited to see Noah right here. Don.
Dawn Zacosta, I'm the principal for the Marshall Academy Middle School in Harlem, New York City.
Okay.
My name is Laura. I work with Ashoka Start Empathy.
My name's Daniel Barron, and I'm the founder of the Project School and now lead the School Project Foundation.
Okay.
My name's Heather. I am also a founder of the Project School in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm the curriculum instruction coach.
Like hearing lots of project in the words you're talking about. We'll be spending some time on that, obviously, today. Dana, something about yourself?
Again, Dana Lauer, for those of you that just came in, from down the road in Harrisburg, and I have spent close to 20 years in education now, and mostly at the high school level, teaching everything from co-taught classes in a special education environment, all the way up through AP classes. Social studies is my specialty, and have also been a part of the Classrooms for the Future program that we had here in Pennsylvania, which really led me down this pathway to
Flashback.
yes, it is. It led me down this pathway to doing more authentic-based learning in my classroom, project-based, inquiry-based, all of those things. For those of you that took the classes, there was so much overlap between them. So, it was through that I started to really focus on what was more authentic in the world in which I taught for my students, and through some different partnerships throughout the country, met Tim almost 7 years ago, and started chatting and challenging one another to grow a little bit more professionally.
Yeah, so we sometimes joke that we're a critical friends group gone wild, right? We couldn't stop talking, and our partner Jill is the third part of that. So I'm Tim Kubik again. I'm coming from Northern Colorado. I am the child of a first grade teacher. Anyone else in the room who has that distinction, or the child of a teacher? I'm just always curious because
if any students in the building could go downstairs and help stack the chairs, that would be great. Thank you.
Because teaching is not ever something I imagined myself doing, but I ended up doing it, and doing it at many, many different grade levels over the course of my career. I've taught from first grade all the way up to postgraduate work at different times over the course of my career. My main stretch was as a high school social studies teacher, and I found the power of project-based learning in all places while volunteer teaching in Liberia, West Africa. I'm not going to go into detail on that experience, but it really convinced me that authentic and relevant work gets students to do amazing levels of work, and that's what we want to talk about today. So click over to the next slide, and Dana, you can frame the question.
If you read the description, we wanted to really start our conversation around this particular prompt. Because we're looking to transform classrooms. Because we see lots of classrooms and lots of teachers all over the country and all over the world every year. And we are always in awe about some of the great things that they're doing. And we love to share those stories. And we love to learn from all of you as well. So we're going to focus on the question, how can we transform our classrooms? Specifically by creating some community partnerships, where you've probably seen a little bit of a theme of that throughout this conference, which really excited us, to encourage that innovation. And as we think about this prompt, and we're going to run a specific protocol with you a little bit later on to facilitate that discussion, we want to first move into a couple of different pieces. So we want to get some background information from you, do a little bit of formative assessment before we jump into the conversation. So we're going to have you choose one of the three key terms that are up there. You can focus on authenticity, you can focus on relevancy, or you can focus on complexity. If you are a tweeter, you can feel free to tweet out what you believe the definition is of that chosen word that you have. And we'd also like you to come up with a question that you might have about either authenticity, relevancy, or complexity that you would hope to have answered during the session. You do not need to tweet out that question, but if you're not a tweeter, feel free to type it on your computer in a Word document or a Google document, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and just simply use a pen and paper. So we'll give you a few moments to process that, come up with your definition and your question that you might have.
Thanks to those of you who are using the hashtags for the session in the room so that we can track what's going on.
That one question that you're creating, or maybe you have more than one if you're an overachiever, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're going to save those questions till the end, and hopefully those questions will be answered throughout the conversation that we have, but we will certainly leave time at the end if we don't get to those questions. We're going to go ahead and walk through very quickly each of these components, start a little bit of the conversation before we get into our main dialogue. So let's start with authenticity. If any of you chose authenticity, would you like to share out that definition that you?
I picked authenticity, but I think I crossed over into relevancy. So,
that is not a problem at all, but feel free.
So I have authenticity sort of like relevancy is my thing. And I thought it was that it easily makes sense to the students, that they can understand it and take ownership of it and make meaning for their own learning. It inspires a value to solve, the value to know, and motivates engagement.
Excellent. Does anybody want to add to, build on, respond to that definition?
I like it. When I think of authenticity, I think of bringing your full self and speaking your truth, and then authentic reciprocity, which is the relationship between two people who are in relationship, is one of the most powerful human conditions. Buber and Ayn Rand said that's what brings spirit into the world when we're reciprocally authentic with each other. And it's very powerful.
Building relationships. Anyone else?
I think there's something, or there can be, and it's a compliment to what Dan has referred to, but to make a difference in oneself or in the world. And I think a lot of it comes down to relationships. It's service.
Absolutely. And, you know, the authenticity piece was what really impassioned me, because I wanted to be able to empower my students to potentially affect change. That That change may or may not happen, but the empowerment piece that comes with the ability to potentially affect change was really important to me. So when I thought about it, it needed to be that community experience, whether it's school, local, state, national, global community that you're connecting to and building those relationships, or some sort of a career component that made it real. So instead of just simulating what might happen in the real world, that actually bringing the real world in and building some community partnerships and drawing on experts that would facilitate that process. So I wrote a book and shared a lot of different stories from a lot of different great schools around the country, called Authentic Learning Experiences, a real world approach to project-based learning. And that was really my passion. And then I met and had discussions with Jill, who's not here, on relevancy, and she helped to kind of shift a couple of components in terms of my thinking. So let's hear about the relevancy piece. And I know we've already kind of established that there's some overlap.
Marianne?
I had, for relevancy, it is important in some way to those involved in the work.
Involved in the work, very important to you.
It has meaning for the students, and that we're not talking about as concepts, that we're talking about things that could affect them now or in the future.
Absolutely. How does it affect us now? How does it affect us in the future?
They're not only just teaching the content, but why does it matter?
Why does it matter? Many of us in this room are from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And if I asked you to specifically sit down in a room and solve all of the educational problems here in Pennsylvania, it would be really relevant to you. If I asked the rest of you to join in, it would be authentic, but it wouldn't necessarily be relevant because you don't live here. You have your own issues in your own states that you need to address with education. So that authenticity piece and the relevancy piece really come into play when we think about what's personal to us and what's present, as you mentioned. You know, I taught history for many, many years, and trying to get my students to understand that those choices in the past have led us to today, but how can we learn the lessons from to lead us into the future and potentially solve some of the problems that we're facing to mitigate some of those circumstances. So the relevancy piece is an integral part to that. And then Tim came in and he didn't complicate things at all, but he focused on the complexity level.
Sure. And I'm really curious about what people think about complexity, because I picked up some vibes on this morning in the conversation. I think the complexity of project-based learning, however we're going to define that, is something that causes a lot of people to be afraid of it. Right? Either a big challenge, or it takes time, or it requires me to let go. So I'm curious what complexity means in this room. Thoughts about complexity? Yes.
I uses multiple learning pathways.
Okay.
I really wasn't able to really define myself, but what I really was trying to come up with was how, like, it takes the math, the sciences, it takes the humanities.
Okay.
To solve a problem.
So two great ideas are the multiple pathways, but also the integration, right? And Dana has some nice stuff in her book about that. Wendy.
Yeah, I was thinking more about meeting the various needs of kids, so like the differentiation piece in it.
Okay, so differentiation that meets the various needs of kids, also part of that complexity. Kevin, and then we'll go to Dan. Yeah, thank you, Dan.
So I was thinking of it as levels of questions and answers that would require a process to achieve progression, not necessarily a final resting place, but where it's something that continues to grow.
So very process focused over several levels, a kind of layering thing. Your students love video games. One of the reasons they love them is video games are complex experiences, right? Because they are that process of leveling up or level jumping, the term we'll talk about a little bit. Danny, what's complexity over here?
Well, I'm thinking of it through a systems lens.
Yeah.
And where there's a lot of ambiguity in place for many components, and things are emerging constantly.
Yes.
So being able to maintain a center, so that it doesn't become chaotic, right? but also it really allows for new relationships and new knowledge to emerge.
Nice. And I like that Daniel is relating that word complexity to complexity science, which is part of the question that I'm very much interested in that I think so often the fear of complexity in project-based learning leads teachers to want to have a level of control that actually prevents us from optimizing it. And I like your metaphor of like having a center, but not letting it get completely out of control. If you don't allow those relationships and those questions from your students to emerge, I'll take it a step further based on this morning's conversations. If you don't support and scaffold and structure so that those things can emerge, then it becomes what we like to call project-based assignment. Right? You're not going to have much complexity. You're going to accomplish exactly what you set out to do as a teacher, which is actually not helping students to be creative or innovative. And there's actually a wonderful group of academics working at the University of Calgary who are trying to look at complexity science and math education and how math classrooms can be really learning selectives that promote the learning of individuals in there. And if you're interested in that side of the research, we can go there. But the last thought I'll offer is there's a really wonderful blog that came out from one of my favorite institutes in the country. It's called the Unreasonable Institute in Boulder, Colorado. It's very close to where I live. Does anyone know the Unreasonable Institute? If you get appointed there, you are, guess, an unreasonable fellow. Right? So the Unreasonable Institute brings a lot of innovators, design thinkers together to sort of be unreasonable together and challenge paradigms. And there was a blog that came out from that about 1.5 years ago called Complicated versus Complex. And you can find that on our website. I'd really recommend reading it. It's literally a 90-second read, sort of making a distinction between the two notions. And it's very important for us that we're staying in the complex space where cool things can emerge and happen, rather than thinking about project-based learning as a very, very complicated, layer-cakey design that I am in charge of managing. That's what I think makes so many teachers scared of it, and it won't optimize their much about the complexity. So, Dana.
And as we think about that complicated versus complexity, what I even experienced in my own world was kind of this continuum. And I was very much on the left-hand side, in which I was creating a lot of what I would call challenging assignments. In a lot of cases, they were research papers in the skies. Very low-level blooms. I become that consumer of information, and all I'm spitting out is just a regurgitation of that information. Rather than moving into this more challenging space of authenticity, relevancy, and complexity, where we are actually saying to our learners, you are the ones participating because this is what they crave and what they want to do. We're extending that learning. We're promoting that depth of knowledge and the mastery piece because they have now become innovative. They are producers of new information rather than just those consumers. And we're giving them an audience in doing that, and not just the audience of the students in the classroom, but moving beyond that into that empowerment piece where they have that potential to affect change with individuals that can actually make that change happen. And so as we think about that art challenge and the challenging assignment, we don't want you to forget that initial question that we have. Momentarily, we are going to come back to that, but we wanted to do one quick little scaffolding piece first as we think about an example of the differences between the two. This is my work, this example here. And I chose this one because several years ago, probably 2008, more than several years ago, I actually won an award from the National Constitution Center down the road for this work, where in my American history class, my kids were actually looking at legislation historically to try to figure out how do we write immigration legislation that would be appropriate for today. I had very specific guidelines that they had to do, requirements that were there, and in the end, they turned it into me. On paper, it was great. I won the award for it. In reflection, and as I looked at the student work, there were varying levels. Some wrote me a paragraph that had very little thought put into it. Some wrote me 2 pages because those were the kinds of students that they were. As I think about it in reflection, I wish I would have given them more opportunity to move forward in more of an authentic, relevant, and appropriately complex way. So I'd like to offer this example. This comes to us from Bergen County Academies in New Jersey. You may be familiar with them. And this is a school that I've been involved with for about 5 years now. And what these students did in this class is they actually partnered with the National Park Service. Because if you remember Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, there was a big issue with flooding on Ellis Island. They had to remove all of the artifacts. They shipped them off down to Maryland to put them in storage, and they actually did not even get the systems, the cooling systems working back in Ellis Island until this past summer. So they had a several-year period where the artifacts were not even there. That, coupled with understanding that not everybody gets the opportunity to visit Ellis Island in person, the National Park Service partnered with Bergen County Academies to develop a virtual visit to Ellis Island. And it has been a 2-year project in the making, and I actually tweeted out a link that gives you some background on a video that goes along with this. But if any of you have ever used the Oculus system, where you're in the headgear, it was in October, a year ago October, so they were about a year into the project, and they put me into the Oculus system and they let me experience it. And it was pretty amazing. This past summer, I went to Ellis Island in person for the first time. And when I walked into the Grand Hall, I felt like I had already been there based on what these students had done. So they partnered directly with the National Park Service to provide this service. They're still perfecting it, and they're hoping to have their launch for the end final product coming up very soon. So as we think about this challenging assignment versus that authentic, relevant, and appropriately complex challenge, what was the potential difference between these two? So why don't you take a moment, turn to the person next to you, or discuss at your table, or partner up with the table if you're by yourself, and talk about that, we'll share out, and then we're gonna move into our conversation on our overarching question.
Dana, can you put the other slide back up to the table? Because that would be helpful for people to see.
Purpose of audience. Right. Is it pretty simple?
The last, read about experts involved.
It's an approach to innovation. Traditional writing streams, but the differences.
Is there a link where we can see these side by side?
The two projects or the?
And like what scientists actually do is do.
Great suggestion.
The reporting came in with like, oh my God, this is great. He's coming in on the angle of like pulling out of the tradition. Yeah, we talk about like, but I see those parallels in this. Because we let kids get involved with experts in our community. But yeah, it was a place to make that transition. Yes, but it's always been. Because it's so rigorous. The science fair is so rigorous. That's what I'm like, yeah, the kids hate it. I told my school board, I'm like, they're slinging their implants into the fires. Because they're so sick, they're tired.
Something.
One of the things that I find sometimes lacking,
And that's
I say, well, over and over again, if you think that's that kind of work, if you don't understand the product, you want to get in with that product, be meaningful elsewhere, I think that's a good idea.
but you know, to be providing students
younger the student, the less strong arrows and advocates will find that resource. So it's a lot of work for them to be able to do that.
I think you're absolutely right, but I also think that sometimes as the young get older, we feel as if we adults need to make those connections so that we're supposed to allow them to find their experts that they can use as mentors and things like that. Sometimes we over shepherd.
I'm talking about the person.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's as well, because sometimes I think we take away some of that
Advocates,
Right.
do that advocacy.
do it for them.
One and both.
Yeah.
And the kids.
We're gonna ask you to pause your conversations. We'll do some share outs, and I'm sure this conversation will also feed into the overarching conversation that will happen here in just a moment. So what do we see as the potential difference between these two examples that we shared?
We talked about audience, which is a blessing and a curse. So having an authentic audience and purpose for what you're doing is really meaningful, and students will be more engaged in it. It's a better learning experience. But we also talked about the fact that that requires teacher work, especially on the younger kid side, to make those connections, both with experts and an authentic audience, which may stop some teachers from taking it on, and that they may overstep the need for that for the older students and not allow them to make that happen on their own and stop them when it shouldn't stop them.
Which is going to be a great segue into what we're going to talk about momentarily.
I think one of the things I appreciated is that it's in the authentic innovation realm that students shine in unexpected ways. And it is a pretty effective way of differentiating in an organic way as opposed to a teacher constructed way.
Nice.
Very powerful. Very
Can
powerful.
you say that one more time?
Kristen's going to tweet it out.
It's the authentic audience, the call to innovate, to do innovative work, differentiates for students in a more organic way than teachers can construct themselves.
So, well, I think we were talking, because I really thought that first assignment, challenging assignment, what could, especially given what's going on today in the world, is very, very relevant and could be very, very meaningful to students depending on where they're living and, the teaching empathy and a lot of those values. And we were talking because, I was kind of like excited about the idea, and my colleagues here were saying, well, yes, so that if we kind of change what was produced by the kids to bring in some of that voice and the audience and the platform to advocate for whatever it is that they're wanting to, so I think that the kernel of it was very much there.
Which is probably why I won an award for it. But I would absolutely agree. If I had it to do over, I would go back. I would change a couple of the facets of it, leave the bones, because I think the structure is really good, but add some of these components that we see over on the right-hand side to really give it depth and give it meaning for the students. Because as it was, doing this over a 2-day period to turn into me meant absolutely nothing to them.
I think that's a big part of talking with teachers about project-based learning or inquiry-based, whatever it is, that we don't have to throw out everything that you've done. That there's good stuff that you can then evolve.
That's where I think the complexity comes in is, it's in the complexity that the roles multiply, the problems multiply, and both those roles and those problems end up being opportunities for students to step up. And it's very hard to anticipate which students will step up with the right stuff at any given point in time. And that's the organic kind of differentiation.
So I want to echo something there, that it is the case that when you are doing more authentic and relevant work, you will be surprised by the students that step up. Because it will not, and many of the things you're describing are what employers say they are looking for in graduates of colleges or high schools. And many of our kids have the assets to do that. But the way teachers tend to design projects, if they hew too closely to that sort of project-based assignment focus, tends to only reinforce and celebrate certain roles, certain assets, certain skill sets, rather than allowing a kid to deploy their full capability. That's why we think this distinction up top here between, let's pretend, right? Many projects start with some sort of entry letter. Let's pretend we have a letter from the mayor or the governor and we'll do this project. You actually talk to your students about an issue like immigration and you say, and the kids say to you, let us participate in this question and give you some ideas about what they could do about the immigration issue. Because we know if they write letters to their legislatures, they will get a polite letter from a 21-year-old intern working in the legislature that says, thank you so much for your letter. Representative so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so will take a look at that. Thumbs up, glad you're an active citizen. And that will be the extent of the participation that kids will get. So I think it's really important that you're letting kids say how they want to participate in this project rather than you predetermining that. Kevin, I know you had a comment, and then I think we'll jump.
In thinking about how like the differentiation, it also, if you tie in a sense of reflection, it allows the students to reflect on what role that they take, whether it is the developer, the organizer, the designer, and that ultimately could help them lead to further exploration of what they want to do after high school.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a big part of what we see the kids that we're working with in different communities across the range of the economic spectrum, really getting some focus about what they think of their assets, what their directions, and as I said in one of my tweets earlier during the session, being able to articulate and advocate for their own learning. Right? But for us, that's a really important part of the potential difference. When students start saying, this is what I need to get where I want to go, that means they're a learner and not just a student. And we work very hard to try to refer to our students as learners more than students for that reason. You want to talk on the next slide? We'll talk a little bit about community. Is there one back one or not? No, that's the first one? Okay, and then we. So, actually jump ahead one more, will you, Dana? And then we'll jump back. So I want to share a quick little story about the setup for the seminar that we're going to do and have a chance for you to really talk about how you do this, learn from each other in your conversations. And we'll use a variation of Socratic seminar to try to do some affinity mapping at the same time. So we'll have up on these 3 charts for you, some key takeaways that if you want, you're welcome to take a picture. I do a lot of work in underserved communities in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this is a teacher that has really inspired me over the years in his thinking about how to reach those kids. And he asked a question in the second year that we were working together that I'd never seen a teacher ask before. And if you've asked it, pat yourself on the back and feel great. But the question that he asked is, what are you learning outside of school? Because I can't teach you unless I know that. And he built an entire project, and you can see a draft version of this, called Our Albuquerque. And the our there was the students, not the teachers, not the adults, but our Albuquerque as kids. Where are the places that we go that we learn things? No matter what that learning might be, it could be on a street corner and some stuff that might make us uncomfortable, or it could be in a public library, or it could be at their faith community. It could be a lot of different places. But Daniel had them build a 3D model of Albuquerque and take all the landmarks in Albuquerque off of that model and make Albuquerque theirs and map where they learned all over the community, so that he then had as a resource things that he could connect what he was trying to do in the classroom to where kids said they were learning. And to get to a question that I think Mary Ann raised, not having to be the teacher responsible for finding all those community connections, but had his students tell him what they thought useful community connections were. And that 3D model ended up getting featured at the Albuquerque airport for about 6 weeks, so that any teenager that came into Albuquerque could see Albuquerque through teenagers' eyes and what was here for them. And that was their sort of public, authentic product, was to share that model with the community for the 6 weeks that the airport agreed to have it on display there where kids could walk in and see that. But it transformed not just Daniel's classroom. He's a humanities teacher in a construction school. Think about that for a minute. It also transformed the way that school thinks about their community relations. And that's what we wanted to get you thinking about in this conversation, is where and what are our students learning outside of the classroom learning environment? Because it's a really important asset that you have then all you have to do is ask your kids to think about that, rather than feel like you have a responsibility. Go to the next slide. It is something that we also like to do to help communities who want some support in that. We've got a lot of experience about what works. The schools I mentioned in Albuquerque all have a community engagement coordinator now as a result of Daniel's project. It's that person's job to tap into those resources, to make connections to parent community assets that are there, to industry partners who actually provide a fair amount of funding to support the project-based learning at the school because they see a value in it, to subject matter experts who can come in and co-teach so that the teacher doesn't feel like it's all on them and doing the design. And that takes a lot of pressure off. And we've learned from that experience and try to help other communities do that as well by doing what we call asset inventories of both your school and your communities. We want you to talk a little bit about some of the assets that you see, and I'll turn it over to Dana to kick off the seminar unless you have a comment you want to make about that.
As we move into the meat of this conversational piece here, we're going to do it in a modified Socratic seminar version. Some of you may have experienced Socratic seminars in the past. I always like to put my own little twist on them. So this is my twist on the Socratic. And I think we're pretty well situated around the room. Now, if we were in a different space, we would actually do a full circle. But I think that the semicircular appearance here will work fine. The purpose behind the Socratic is to actually ask really good questions to uncover answers. So the purpose of this dialogue that we're going to have is to think about asking questions and keeping in mind that as you ask the questions, you may have a response that you want to give, but you may want to respond with a question to challenge that question that's been given. You don't have to raise your hands. We're not going to have a ball that we pass around or a talking stick or anything like that. We're just going to let this organically happen, and we are going to record the questions that you have. And at the conclusion of the conversation, then we're going to do something called affinity mapping with those to see what kind of trends that we have that evolved through the conversation. Before we start, I just want to give you an example of what not to do. I had a superintendent at a district that had come in. It was his first day on the job. I've been working with the district for quite some time. We had all the admins together from all the buildings, the assistant superintendent. I'm running them through this protocol. He was so gung-ho that as it started, he started rapid firing 20 questions in a row. I could not keep up with the questions, nor could anyone else, and he would not let anyone else speak. So don't just ask 20 questions in a row. We're going to have the dialogue, have the conversation, but as the questions arise, we're going to record those. Keeping in mind, because the key to uncovering the answers is to ask the right questions, we're going to have a little bit of a cue. Every time a question is asked, I am going to ask you all to clap. If you don't hear a clap for quite some time, we realize that maybe we should think about asking a question. Are there any clarifying questions on the instructions before we begin? This is our focus question. Remember, we started with this at the beginning, and to help to facilitate the discussion, we have brought in the chart as well that we spent some time focusing on. How can we transform our classrooms? By creating community partnerships to encourage innovation. Feel free to bring in any of your own experiences. Feel free to bring in any of your thoughts based on the last 40 minutes that we've been in here together. And whomever wants to start, may kick it off. And I will ask that you just speak up loudly enough because we are being live streamed.
No, I'm just looking at that, and I shared with my table, we are in the process of science revision right now. And so we've had a very traditional science fair in Pennsylvania that's been supported by local colleges, and parents have an expectation. I'm sure you've seen the meme about how much turmoil the science fair causes in households. But in that vein, it's been a transition where we're pulling away to 20% time and I have teachers in the middle level doing some wonderful things where the kids are actually, instead of the trifold, producing TED Talks and writing books about science, or like, it's just innovative. But then somebody went to the newspaper to challenge the process of removing the science fair. And in the process, it's again, like, how do we get parents comfortable with this transition? Because they see that replication as rigorous versus this broad innovation.
They got the protocol down already.
I guess I'd like to throw out, it's almost a definition question, but my group works with technology-rich schools, and the state of Vermont has passed legislation requiring flexible pathways for students, and it raises the question for us, what does all this mean if we're now talking about a ubiquitous learning community in terms of anytime, anywhere, for almost any age?
Remember, you can feel free to respond. You don't just have to ask a question.
I'm going to build on the first question about how to get parents comfortable. So that would also apply to your school community, so the teachers or administrators, and also the community, that if you want people involved, how do we get all of the levels comfortable with something that might be, that might be completely different from the way those groups are traditionally thinking.
I'm wondering about what we mean by transformation of our classrooms, and why can they be transformed without linking to community partnerships?
Without it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was, right before you said that, I was thinking about what assumptions are embedded in the question. And I think that surfaces some. But I'm wondering about assumptions made.
If someone would like to speak to any of those assumptions, that would be a great time to do so.
One assumption clearly is that community partnership leads to innovation.
I think another is, and it kind of gets to that ubiquity issue. That on the one hand, we're talking about community partnerships. On the other hand, we're still talking about classrooms.
So I'm gonna throw out the white elephant in the room, and how do we do this among the pressure to possess, and in the world of it's all about doing the same, doing the same. How does this look in a classroom when the focus is standardized achievement?
Maybe the more partnerships that come into play, they'll understand how silly testing is, and then
That would be nice. And now we've got a conversation going.
Just to comment on how do we engage parents, community, and people at all levels. In the fall, I put together a conference of 30 people of levels from directors of departments at the college level to CEOs of businesses, parents of alum, current parents, board of trustees at our school, to create a conversation of how do we engage STEM and project-based learning. And the ultimate thing that came out of it is how can we now put this into action, and how can we how do we put conversation into action?
going back to the assumption thing, I think one of the huge assumptions that in the greater community is what purpose do they have in the school? Why should they be going into the school when the educators are the ones that are supposed to be educating children? Especially when you have a large immigrant population surrounding your school. That's not the culture they came from. So, I mean, they teach their kids the stuff they teach them at home, but all of the school learning happens in the school without them there. So how do we change that mentality to get more of the community involved? Making them realize that they are part of not only educating our students, but actually changing the culture of the area.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because we oftentimes say that, we are the experts in the classroom, but I think about teaching law for 12 of my years in education. I'm not a practicing attorney. I know an awful lot based on those 12 years of teaching it, but I'm not a practicing attorney. So I oftentimes had to turn to those experts in my community that could then feed into the work that students were doing, because I didn't have all of those answers, which is a really good place to be in, to not have those answers for the kids.
One of the things that we've done at the school, in 8th grade, all the 8th graders are allowed to take 1 week, and it's different, I know, and this is my first year in private school, so it's very different in that regard, but the 8th graders go into the community in groups. They go to 13 communities or 13 community organizations, and they use design thinking to try to figure out the empathetic needs of that organization, and then how to design a protocol that would help. And then it's 1 week, it's pretty intense. And at the end of the week, the community organization members come and listen to the presentations of the 8th graders and what they could do to help. It's an awesome week. That's in October. And now we're trying to figure out what we want to do some sort of like community service regard for these organizations that have donated their time and resources to us, but we don't want it to be just something that's done. We want it to have that authentic perspective. So we're trying to figure out how we can follow up and have it be student driven and meaningful at the same time.
And I'm going to ask you a question that goes along with that. How are you embedding those components within the content and the standards to ensure that what the students are then achieving is mastery of those pieces?
So they're learning about each element of design thinking per day, and it's in the values of our school. So we don't have standards that it's being embedded into, which is nice, but I know it's not everybody's reality. So the mastery part is just what they create and what they come up with. And the groups are small enough. It's only 4 or 5 students that everyone takes part. And I guess mastery is defined by doing it. There's no like rubric or anything.
And I'm spinning off that, like one great question though is how can we, because I do believe it's possible, but it's difficult, is like your kids are going to be hitting the reading, writing, speaking, listening standards, but how can we create a growth measure, which we're all compelled to based on the state, when we're using this type of learning, how can we efficiently do that?
I'm wondering about where the innovation is. What are we talking about in terms of innovation? Is the innovation the encouragement to move out to community partnership, because that would be innovative in a traditional school, or is the end result going to be an innovative product design process? So where does the innovation exist? Is it from the locus of the school that's changing its practice, or is something innovative happening out in the field?
If I can just chime in with an example, because I suspect that's something that a lot of you are wondering. The school that I mentioned in Albuquerque, we're getting on this project, is a school that was actually started with tremendous support from the Associated General Contractors of New Mexico, because they've sort of looked at where that industry is going in the Southwest. The Southwest is booming in terms of construction, and they're pretty sure the industry will be broke in 5 to 10 years under current practices. right? So they want to make an investment in the children of Albuquerque to produce the innovation that will help them figure out how to reduce costs and allow them to remain viable as an industry and double the size of Albuquerque in the next 10 to 15 years. They're looking to children who have not been trained yet in college or grad schools of construction to look at the industry and say, why do you do it that way? Right? Because the people that they have in the field right now in leadership positions can't think outside that box. So they're making that investment to do that. And that's part of what we're thinking about innovation is identifying some community partners that have a similar stake, right? If they have a problem they're trying to solve that the people that they talk to in their echo chamber can't solve it, they love talking to students who ask the dumbest, naivest questions. Because sometimes those are the questions that no one professionally would ever ask. That's partly what I'm thinking about with innovation along those lines.
Hey, correct me if I'm wrong, Sid, didn't they hire an attorney for the school to protect the students and what they were producing?
There's an attorney associated with that school in particular to protect students in lots of ways. So one, to help with IP issues. If the students develop some really cool thing that's going to change a bunch of stuff, we need to make sure that the kids actually own that, and the school actually owns that. But also because of the fact that I would say probably 35 to 40% of those students are undocumented immigrants. There are also attorneys there that work with the students to protect them safely moving about in the community, working with community partners, thinking about possibly moving on to colleges so that they have legal counsel for how they can do that, because that's a big challenge we face with a lot of those students is, yeah, I want to go work at that place, but it's right next to the police station. Right? There's a new job site, we're going to go down and we're going to see that, but I don't want to get picked up. So the attorneys work with them, help them learn to advocate for themselves and what their rights are as undocumented immigrants at the moment, and actually help them work on pathways to citizenship as part of their authentic and innovative work. So it's a very important part of the school culture is that the kids are acknowledged as persons, even though they may not have the legal status of persons in the U.S. legal system. And I think that's pretty innovative too.
And it would be great if anybody else would like to speak to the innovation question.
Yeah. One of the things that I think of is when you look at the replication, which is maybe that was just copying from what you maybe were expecting to be the final, but I was thinking of it more of a group of students where you might have them working on a certain project that next year's students won't, or if you have two periods where it's that one class that's doing it, but it's you do it, it's done, or they're the ones that own it and are continuing it, but you can't keep revisiting that same project because it doesn't match the group you have now, or it's like the Ellis Island. Like kids every year are going to create that because it was created. So how can you? It has to go back to the learners then of what their passion is and what's happening at the moment that did not happen last term or last year.
And just to clarify that replication piece, it's actually, and I don't want to misquote Chris, that he says, if you get 30 of the same thing, that's a recipe, right? So that replication piece, certainly your question as it goes to replication and how do we sustain that through multiple years is an important one.
It seems to me that you could, in a more critical sense, change replication to reproduction, because the traditional instruction tends to reproduce the outcomes that have historically been present. Where if the outcome is innovation, you're interrupting the status quo by giving kids who have never had an opportunity to be engaged in that kind of creative thought and process with others to have that experience.
I think maybe this is a bit of a tangent maybe on your question about innovation, but when I try to think ahead more about where we could go with community partnerships, and there was a reference to needing to consult with a practicing attorney, is what's the difference between educator and pedagogue or pedagogist? And I'm trying to encourage the
teachers I work with to think about that, because the temptation is to think that we're outsourcing education somehow by sending kids off to community experts, when in fact they still need a pedagogist to help structure their trajectory. But there are educators everywhere.
And it's an excellent point. Teaching 17-year-olds that read at a first grade level that are interacting with these individuals, they don't know what's in their IEP. They don't know the structural supports that I need to put in place to scaffold and to differentiate and to ensure that those children are going to be successful. But they have that working knowledge outside of the school. They're the experts in that other content area. So it's an excellent question.
I think we heard some of those questions this morning around the conversation about fears that teachers have in the opening panel. And I'm famous for making everyone participate in workshops. So I know we've had some people who've been talking a lot. I'd really like to encourage other people to sort of break through that possible fear of participation in this conversation and maybe offer connection to what you heard this morning in terms of that fear of letting go of our control as the teacher, how the language of balancing educator and pedagogue, how we share those roles with other people in our community, is an empowering possibility for everyone in our schools and our communities. So thoughts about how this sort of connects to some of the conversations we had this morning would be welcome. Yeah, students, please join in.
I mean, I'm an SLA junior, but I feel like the fear of kind of letting go of control, and like actually letting go of control as a teacher actually promotes innovation and motivation because it gives us a lot of flexibility in what we're able to do. I think like having flexibility in like projects that you're given and like modes of presentation that they can come out in. Like there's so many different forms of media that we can produce and that we're comfortable in producing. So I think if you're just giving your students like the guideline of here's your goal, now go pursue it, and like they can pursue it in any type of way, I think that's sort of the best way of promoting innovation and flexibility. So kind of just letting go of your guidelines, breaking down your walls, and just saying, go do this. I'm here. Like I can guide you along the way, but I mean you're free. So, flexibility.
Jumping off of Casey's. Thank you for joining us, Casey.
Can I just ask a question to the student? What I'm grappling with a lot is the elementary and middle school perspective. And so as a high school junior, you have that ability and that voice. So what responsibilities do we have to our youngest learners to allow them to have that voice or to encourage them to speak out? Because all too often, you know, a kid asks us a question or a student challenges an adult, younger ones, and they're considered fresh, you know, or so what is our responsibility? How do you establish that with our youngest learners?
I have a question along those same lines. Is it maybe time we rethought not only what we teach when in terms of standards, but how we teach our students when? Like, do we go back to how education was started in the United States with you go to 6th grade learning whatever it is you need to learn to be a good citizen, and then after 6th grade you go and learn what you need for your chosen profession. Where if you want to continue your traditional education after 6th grade, you either had to have a scholarship or money. I'm not saying we need to go back fully to that, but maybe treating our middle school and high schools more like vocational schools than traditional middle and high schools.
Question that is definitely.
I want to make a connection with something that I learned yesterday. It was a session on
asking powerful questions. And it was very similar to this in workshop model, putting you through a protocol of asking questions. And what we noticed going around the room, the folks looked at their challenges and asked very deep questions. There was not a single one of them that was related to content or to standards. And that they were all related to empathy and the social growth of students, and where does that live in our curriculum?
And I'll just offer a quick example at the elementary level, since that was a question, and I'm certain that would probably be a burning question throughout. We have worked with a school in Dallas that actually had their kindergarten and first grade take a trip to the zoo after doing science content and mimicry and camouflage. And these students were tasked with redesigning a specific zoo exhibit. And the little kids went in, we were there on the day they were going on their field trip, and they had their clipboards and they're ready to go out to the zoo. And they were taking notes on what they saw and drawing what they saw. And then they had the opportunity to ask questions to the executive director of the zoo. And one little 6 or 7 year old, you know, this high, told the director, I want you to get down on your knees like this and see what we see, because we can't see anything. So they were tasked with redesigning the exhibit so that they could, as you know, short little kids, be able to experience what we as adults see. And they had to be able to do that through the science content that they had been studying. And so we're doing this with 5, 6, and 7 year olds in that way.
And that's a great example. That zoo director realized he had $1 million idea when he heard it, right? Because that's the population that goes to the zoo. And usually you see parents carrying their children around like this so they can see the exhibits, and you see them reading to the exhibits. And the director suddenly realized, what if 5 and 6 year old kids helped us redesign the zoo for 5 and 6 year old kids? And that the Dallas Zoo has since reached out to their fundraisers, and everybody said, we got this great project we want to do. We need to fund these kids doing this. It's going to make our zoo a cutting edge zoo in the country, because it's a zoo that was designed by 5 and 6 year olds for 5 and 6 year olds. So the kids are all going to get credit, you know, at the exhibits. This exhibit was designed by this team of kids from this school. So later when they take their kids there and their kids can see someday, right, they'll say, hey, that was me. I redesigned this exhibit so kids like you could see. So there's real, I mean, that's relevant to kids, right? And it gets back to the comment that someone made about what responsibilities we have to let our youngest educated or youngest kid learners have voice. A lot of teachers would have told that kid, mind your manners, don't ask questions like that to the director, you know, be polite. And it was to the credit of the teachers who were there that they saw that opportunity and reimagined their entire authentic learning experience based around that. So one last comment, and then I think you want to get some opinion.
I always, this is kind of one of my mantras, and I say we standardize the curiosity out of kids by 3rd grade when we start our standardized testing. And so how do we get back to that, right? Because you're right, our youngest students are the ones who ask all the questions. Every time they see something, they're curious about it. And if we can get back to that, I really think that kids, you know, the biggest challenge in middle school is my kids don't care about what I'm teaching. Well, of course they don't, because it's what you're teaching. It's not about what they want to learn.
Well, I think part of the answer is everyone should be the child of a 1st grade teacher. Because for 18 years, I was encouraged to ask questions like that by my mother, because that's what she did every day at work, right? Was get kids to ask questions and celebrate their questions. And she never stopped treating me like a 1st grade kid when I went off to college. So it obviously had an impact. But we'd like to give you a chance to do some of this work, and I'll let Dan take it from there.
As you probably got through this experience, you know, we're in most cases a bunch of strangers in this room, and so sometimes it's hard to have a conversation with a bunch of strangers. When you're in the classroom, it gets a little bit easier as you know the students to be able to do this with students and or work with your staff to do this, because they feel a little bit more at ease having that conversation. So as we come up with these questions, and typically conversations last about 20 to 25 minutes, and I've had as many as 5 pages of questions, but we have all of these unorganized ideas. sometimes somebody asked a question and somebody asked an additional question that maybe did not even relate without a conversation in between. And really the goal of doing this is to be able to continue the conversation forward, but to structure those ideas in such a way that they don't seem so unorganized. So what we would like to do now is to take a moment and see if we can come up with 3 themes that maybe emerged in the questions that you had. Now, in some cases, maybe only 2 themes emerge. In some cases, there may be as many as 4, but typically 3 tends to be the sweet spot. Hopefully everybody can read Tim's handwriting. As you look at that, do you see any particular question that jumps out at you that you'd like to start with a particular theme in mind?
The question that says, how do we change the mentality that says teaching jobs? That says teacher's job. That is the teacher's job, not that.
Okay, and you would like to think that way, or not? I'm not sure what the question is.
Fourth one down on the left. No, in the middle, right in the middle, Dana, right in front of you, right there. How do we change them in? Nope, up one, right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, those are 2 separate questions.
Yeah.
And what kind of a theme do you think we're getting at here? So we'll start with this one and we'll color code it in green.
We base it on the 3 things that you had in the beginning, relevancy.
Okay. All right. So we're looking at mentality here, changing mentalities and changing people's ideas. Do we see any other questions that might go with that in particular?
First one, parents.
How do we get parents comfortable with this?
There's the educator pedagogue. It's something, maybe it's something about roles.
The 3rd question on the first sheet, same theme.
All levels of school community. And if you don't see any more with that right now, someone else could pick a different question that you think perhaps there was something that was emerging.
I think also, how do we do this under mentality? The last question on the first chart.
And you want to keep that with the green?
I think so. We're talking about how do we change the mentality that says teachers, jobs. I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a mentality.
Especially when it comes down to where our teachers in Philadelphia, we're measured by those standards and by the outcomes of those tests.
There's a couple of questions around assessment and growth. In terms of how do we know what kids are gaining from the experience? How do we? It's on the middle page. 3rd question up in the bottom. How can we create a growth measure?
So we're starting anew.
Yeah, a couple around that.
Is that related to the last one on the right?
Empathy and social growth.
Yeah.
So I guess, what responsibilities do we have to our young learners so that we know?
So you're saying that goes with the assessment?
I think the question around transformation actually goes with the assessment piece, because how do you, I'm sorry, it's on 4th one down the 1st page. Because if we don't know what transformation is, how do we measure whether we're getting
Sure, assess it.
Very good. Feel free to add to either the 2 themes that we have so far, or again, a 3rd.
I think you could take a 3rd theme when you start talking about outside stakeholders. So the 1st and 3rd question on the 2nd chart, how do we engage our parents and community, as
well as what purpose does the community have in our school?
Maybe the second question on the left has to do with kind of defining what we're talking about in terms of community.
This one is orange as well. Are we having a hard time?
Well, there's
fitting
kind of
those?
one about how do we do it, right? So how do we, the one when we're not circled all the way on the right, do we go back to earlier ideas of how to teach all the way on the right?
Yes.
Nice. It's kind of looking at how do you, no, I think it's more around how do you do this? So
you want to do theme?
I think so.
Okay.
So theme 4.
Yeah. Sometimes there are 4 themes.
I mean, the one around, on the last one on the middle page, how many balance innovative projects? How do you keep a student driven in the middle of that page? How do we put conversations into action? Those are all around how do you do
The rest of
it.
the tests fit into that last,
how do we do it?
those questions really fit into that last theme. It's really about, so what is the innovation? What are the assumptions that go along with it? How do we,
As we look at the themes and as we think about these things, thinking about innovation, thinking about assessment, thinking about how do we get individuals involved at these levels, what does all of this mean? It begins to allow us to carry on conversations a little bit further. If you were doing this with students in your own classroom, now they have kind of a guide, the map to continue to move forward. They could even break it down insofar as maybe this team or group of students wants to focus on this particular theme that's emerged and they feel strongly about it and they want to find out the answers to that and maybe some solutions. If you're talking about it with the faculty, now we could potentially set up some committees to explore these things further to determine, all right, how do we as a faculty, as a staff, how do we define innovation? How do we bring innovation into our classrooms? How are we going to assess these pieces? What does that look like at the end? How do we bring people on board? And you have different committees that form that do that. So then as you start this conversation, it leads to those questions. And what we see, and I think as Kristen alluded to, by the time they get to the 3rd grade, they stop asking questions. And so we want to be able to bring them into that space where they continue to ask questions, and this is just one way to do it. And if you are struggling with your students all participating in something, in a discussion protocol, I would encourage you to check out the Harkness protocol, or I like to call it a spider web discussion, and I can tweet out a link on how that works because every student has to participate in that, and you do some mapping on who's participating and how they're participating. And that's just the 20-second pitch of that one.
I don't know if you're familiar with James Bean. He's a middle level theorist, I guess. But he uses a very similar process, except it's a longer, more extended process of distilling thematic ideas from students' questions. And it's a process of inviting the students to ask questions about themselves, about the world, synthesizing them in groups. And it works really well with middle grade kids. And it's very simple.
You're gonna have to look that one up.
Look that up.
And if you could tweet that out, hashtag it, and we'll have the resource.
I'd like to ask for a little reflection at this point on how this process that we've gone today felt authentic, relevant, and eventually complex for you all. Because that was part of our designing intention, was to think about an authentic problem that was relevant to you, that would allow complex thinking about that problem to emerge. So just some reflections on the process of the 5,400 seconds that we spent together, right? Where it's not surprising to us that the question you come to in the end is, how do you do this? That emerged. But what's the value of allowing those themes to emerge up through conversation? rather than telling you these are the 4 things you have to take back to your school and have conversations about.
I think one of the things is that it helps you to move forward. So it wasn't like we did something and it was finished. It sort of helped you to organize thinking around the topics that we came up with so that you can take your next step. And it gives you a path to whatever those next steps are going to be.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne. Other thoughts about the process of our 5,400 seconds together?
Realizing that it didn't start off quickly. Like we had received instruction, and then she gave us wait time. She didn't badger us, ask a question, or start a conversation. So realizing that we had to do this at our job, or in the classroom, or with faculty members, that it's not going to be our expected outcome might not be what we get at the beginning. And then realizing that you give people time so that they can make, valid questions.
Okay, so that sometimes spending that 5,400 seconds time processing is really more valuable than just plowing through what you need to cover. All right, and if the takeaways, hopefully these takeaways are more relevant to you because you produced them than if we had said, we travel all the country and do this kind of work with schools and here's what you need to know to do it. That creates opposition immediately. And I think most of your students would echo that too in your classrooms, especially when you start teaching about some things that they actually have some prior knowledge about. And as Casey mentioned earlier, when it comes to technology, for example, and trying to figure out how to integrate that, our students are often much better at participating with that than many of us are as adults. So sort of saying, this is what you need to do with your video may conflict with a lot of students' opinions about what you need to do with video. I consult with my son, who's 18 years old, on how to do social media, right? And like what I should do for my business, because he just started his own music business last week, and he's got more followers than I do, right? So I'm like, Ken, how you doing? And he's like, he's got great ideas because he's learned by doing. Other reflections on the process.
I experienced personally the most complexity in the comparing of the 2 units, and the complexity was heightened by you being a much stronger advocate for the newer unit than you were for the previous unit. So they trying to grapple with that dissonance of which one was better and why was what I think really generated a good complex conversation.
I'm trying to figure out in designing tasks for students how you know when you've reached like the middle of that Venn diagram. How do you know the authenticity, complexity, and relevancy is there?
People have any, people have any thoughts or experiences from that where you've had one that just like it really seemed like a clip?
I think part of that would be through student reflection.
Was in the reflection?
And through student reflection.
Yeah.
I mean, it being authentic or relevant to you,
Yeah, that's the thing. I think student reflection would probably be the almost only way to go.
So 2 thoughts that I like to share on that question. One is, for a long time, I've realized that a measure of a highly successful project is whether you have to clean it up at the end. If your students leave all the things that they're making for you to deal with, it probably could have been better. If they rush out of the building with it to show parents, to show somebody in the community, a local youth shelter, a business owner, and say, hey, we've been thinking about ways that you can market and use social media, and we want to share this idea with you, you've got a winner project. So if it stays in your room and it's your responsibility when it's over, sit back and think about how the authenticity and relevancy could be improved.
I'm thinking again about complexity in terms of some things may be more relevant to some students and more authentic to others and more complex for others. And yet, if you look at the class as a whole, all 3 elements are there. And so, it's a very high design level when you can hit all 3 for all kids. I think
And related to that, the second thing I'll share that I think is really helpful in knowing that it works is most of us start these kinds of projects with some kind of challenge or question. whether you're coming from a UBD framework and thinking essential question, or whether the traditional project-based learning framework and thinking of a driving question, or whatever you're going to call it, right? You know you've got your kids when they want to take that question and pick it apart and personalize it, right? When they want to start doing some things with it, say, that's kind of an interesting question, but my spin on it is over here. And then you have a conversation with kids, which is why we've had conversations at Project Arc about trying to encourage teachers to get a launch question. Get a question that launches inquiry, and sort of, to use language from John Seeley Brown and Doug Thomas's new culture of learning, it sort of bounds the field where the inquiry is going to start, but doesn't mean that everything has to stay exactly in that field. And there are effective ways where students come at you and say, I think our question is really over here, that you can look at how you can integrate the standards you were trying to help them master and the social and emotional learning goals, the attributes and skills you're trying to help them master, even if they're going in a slightly different direction with where they think this project matters. Somebody talked about, I love that somebody talked about Dana's project in the context of the debates today about Syrian refugees, right? Students may want to go that direction rather than talking about traditional immigrant issues along the southern border of the United States, or of course, I'm a dual citizen, so those troublesome Canadians coming down from the north all the time, right? Whatever issues are that people are thinking of, if your students take your question and run with it, that's a sign that you have authentic and relevant thoughts on the table for them to work with. And if you let them run with it, then you will get the complex learning that you're looking for. And if you say, no, that's not really the project I had planned for us, then you're back at project-based assignment.
So I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with you when you said that everyone comes at learning with some sort of a question. Because I worked in enough places around this country where their essential questions are really learning standards.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so when a student walks in the room, it says, this is what you have to learn today. So why do I even engage? Because all I need to do is look at the board, tell me what it is I'm supposed to learn today, and then I can put my feet up and go to sleep.
Yes.
And so I challenge us to really dig deep into what our systems are requiring for us, the frameworks that we're being confined by, and to really take time to say, what is it about this learning objective standard that's really important? What's going to be enduring for our students? And start to think about your questions that way.
And I'll say thank you for challenging me on that, because if that's what people heard in the room, that was not my intent at all. I say within project-based learning, we generally encourage people to design questions. I agree that a lot of the project-based learning that we see ends up being project assignments precisely for what you're doing. We designed a project that will take you exactly to what we need you to do. And Dana and I were actually at a conference in Texas a couple of years ago where we actually heard a teacher say, and I think I had to chain Dana down so she didn't jump up, you know, if your kids master the standards before the project's over, that's great. You can just stop the project because you've achieved your end in mind. And the two of us were just like, that's horrifying to think of it. You just say, you've demonstrated mastery, so now move on and do something else. You don't have to finish this thing that you cared about and we're working on it, right? So, and I think that's part of the problem that you're talking about. I know John had a final comment, and we're getting close to noon. We want to respect that you need some time to eat.
You only got about an hour to eat.
Yeah, it's a short time to eat. So, John,
I
thoughts?
just wanted to extend on Daniel's observation that students experience this differently, and not every student is going to thrive in any particular project.
Yeah.
And I hear teachers suggest that, well, let's do a spring project and one project a year, and that's just a crapshoot. You know, you might, first of all, you're not going to get very good at it. Right. You only do it once a year.
Right. Yeah, and you're not doing project-based learning if you're waiting until after testing is over. You're doing project-based or performance-based assessment.
Right. So the idea of having enough opportunities that each student does get connected once or twice a year, that's enough to keep them going to school. That's enough to keep them thinking that they are learners. Otherwise, we're really taking a risk that we'll miss them.
Sure.
John,
We got a minute and a half.
Okay, because the role of student choice, both around the project and in the project, is absolutely critical. You know, and we didn't really get into the student voice and choice around projects, but if they have an entry point from their own passion or interest or curiosity, they're going to be much more likely to hit the mark.
Yes.
That's part of that relevancy piece.
So I know Dana mentioned earlier that she has to run to try to get her daughters back to a basketball game this afternoon. So if you have any immediate questions, if you have any immediate questions that you'd like to ask Dana, I'd encourage you to approach her as we wrap up this session. I may or may not get home to Denver tonight, depending on the blizzard that's coming into Denver. So I'm around at least for a while. And if you would like to join me for lunch and talk or reach out to us by Twitter, we'd be more than happy to hear from you and the way that you carry these 4 themes forward. I hope you'll consider doing an activity like this with your schools that are wrestling with the question of how do we make learning more authentic and relevant so that students can dig in a complex way. It's a nice way to run a faculty meeting in terms of trying to come up with the themes that are relevant to your school. And the last thing that we'll say is that one of the commitments that the 3 of us brought when we came together was that we were tired of workshops that told us what to do. We're interested in workshops that help you figure out what you need to do. And for us, this is very much about fit with your community than fidelity to any of the concepts that we laid down. We want to see you taking what we have given you and running with it in the same way we hope that your students will take what you give them and run with it. So we'd love to hear back from you about how this plays out this spring, next fall, etc. We're very active on Twitter, so you can tweet results there. And please check in with Dana if you need to before she has to blast off. And I'll be around for at least the next hour or so if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Where she plays she's here. Wouldn't we have to drive back to Harrisburg? Our game starts at 2. It's an hour before you get back.
Dana drives.
Good luck.
They're up on the board there. Our both, and I'll write our project director.
But they have power to.
Yeah. So that what we did was we put some questions.